to imitate his military voice. PCC, by the numbers. My name's John Robson. I've been 3 times a councillor at Tauranga City Council. I've been the choice by 3 mayors and my peers to take the sort of lead on the finance role. So I've been the chair of the Finance Audit and Risk Committee, the Finance and Risk Committee, the deputy chair of the Strategy, Finance and Risk Committee when we had an external chair. Okay. Thank you. Well, we'll work on this. So my name's John Robson. I'm a 3-time councillor, 3 times elected councillor of Tauranga City Council. And I've had the privilege of being, if you like, the go-to for 3 mayors and my peers on council to be the sort of finance guy. I was the chair of the Finance and Risk Committee under Mayor Gregory Brownless, the gentleman sitting over there in the corner trying to be inconspicuous. So I have some experience in council. Before I was on council, I had a career in 1988. I was lucky enough to be offered a job when I was just completed 5 years OE in management consultancy, and I had a career in management consultancy which lasted 12 years. I retired in the last year of last century. One of the things you need to know is that some of the information you've been given in the last few years, even recently, probably can't be relied on. Some of you may have heard Anne Colley on Q&A recently, talking about how they'd started to restore the reputation of Tauranga City Council. There's a company called Key Research. They're a local company, independent of council, professional market research company, and every year they're employed by council to assess what the community thinks in terms of image and reputation. And in front of you are the latest numbers. Now, what these are is a net score. So this is the number of satisfied people less the number of dissatisfied people. And the place you most commonly see this type of thing is in those people aspiring to be Prime Minister when One News reports the results of their variant poll. And what you can see is, under Gregory Brownless, the council's image and reputation was positive. Now, it's hard to get a score above 50, because that means 75% like you and 25% don't. That gives you a score of 50. So it's hard to get a score above 50. But fair to Greg, he got a positive score. It's hard to get a positive score in local government. We rate you, we tax you. We're not popular. Temby Powell successfully took Greg's +5 and turned it into -38. And Polly, first year, -29. Second year, -21. And apparently, going from -21 to -32 is an improvement in Polly land. It's important that you understand, if you like, what's true and what's not true. It's important that you critically analyse the numbers. Now, none of this is hidden. These numbers are taken from a council report. Your media, however, for whatever reason, haven't taken that information and put it on the front page of the Bay of Plenty Times. I'll leave you to figure out why. The 2024-2034 long-term plan, which has been signed off by the Commission, starts being implemented from July 1, was not consulted on. There was a consultation on a draft 24-34 long-term plan. But in that long-term plan, the rates requirement went up 76%. In the plan they signed off, the rates requirement goes up 164%. In the plan that was consulted on, there was no 3 waters. No 3 waters. In the plan they signed off, 3 waters was back in. In the plan they consulted on, the most important roading project in Tauranga, was in. There was nearly $300 million in that plan. In the plan they signed off, the most important roading project in Tauranga was gone. But their museum, their stadium, at least a bit of it, their exhibition centres, their big new library, their Memorial Park pool complex, they were all in there. But the most important roading project in Tauranga was gone. The plan that's in was not consulted on. What was consulted on doesn't look anything like the plan that's starting on July 1.
What facilities are you going to promote?
It will. Welcome to engage, sir, after we listen to this. This audience has not been listened to, you know, and I want them to get a chance to see something from the other side.
We've got to make some.
Here's the plan as it currently exists, the long-term plan. What you can see in the long-term plan is the debt, the red line, in 2034, the debt in the city will be $3 billion. Now the blue line represents the numbers in the long-term plan. And you say, well, how come the numbers in the long-term plan and the number you're saying are different? And the reason is because in 2023, legislation was changed by central government. And what it said to councils is you can borrow money that the ratepayers will be liable for paying back, but it doesn't have to appear in your books. Right? This is the IFFA. Right? So what happened is there's been a decision made by the Commission to borrow first 177 million and then additional monies to basically pay for Te Manawataki, that's the Civic Centre project, so over 300 million. They don't appear, that amount does not appear in the council's books, but you're still liable for it. Now the good news about that borrowing, that 300 plus million, is it's less flexible and more expensive. Hang on, that's not good news. Less flexible and more expensive than the other borrowings of council. At the end of 2034, this city will be in debt to the tune of $3 billion. Now, it's a big number, and potentially, how do you put it in context? Well, one way to put it in context is to compare it to other cities in 2034. So taking debt numbers from the draft long-term plans of other cities, because we did ours ahead of everyone else, because as Garth pointed out, there are people in this city in a hurry. Taking the debt numbers from other cities, Christchurch, and dividing it by their population, we then work out debt per capita in the other major cities in New Zealand. Christchurch, somewhere around the 7,000 mark. Hutt City, somewhere around the 6,000 mark. Wellington, less than 12,000. Hamilton, less than 12,000. Auckland, just under 11,000. Tauranga, over 14,000. Over 20% higher than any other metro city on a debt per capita basis. But when you look at the red column, when we add the IFF funding in, suddenly we are 40% more indebted per capita than any other major city in New Zealand. 40% more indebted. Now, how reliable are these numbers? Well, all these numbers are taken, except for the IFF number, are all taken from published sources. Right? I don't make this stuff up. Right? How reliable are Tauranga's numbers? Well, sadly, not as reliable as you want them to be. I went through and looked at Tauranga City Council's plans, 10-year plans, and looked at what they said we were going to have in terms of debt or in terms of rates requirement in 10 years' time when they do a 10-year plan. And then what the actual situation was 10 years later. Right? So they do long-term plans every 3 years. So the easiest numbers to use were those numbers 9 years ahead. So they probably underestimate. Every time I looked over a 9-year period, the debt was always higher than they said it was going to be 9 years earlier. The rates requirement was always higher than they said it was going to be 9 years earlier. In the period I looked at, which uses the long-term plans from 2012 to 2024, the smallest 9-year variance I could find was 48%. Right? The debt was 48% higher than they said it was going to be 9 years before. So if anything, those numbers, on the basis of the history of this city and the history of Tauranga City Council's plans, are low. So the question, how do we get to a situation of accumulating so much debt? And how do we get to a situation where what we plan as debt, invariably, we're more indebted? Well, one reason might be our project budgeting at Council. In 2020, the democratically elected councillors of Tauranga City Council were told that the Cameron Road project would cost $85 million. $40 million for stage 1 and $45 million for stage 2. In 2024, we know that stage 1's costs currently north of 110 million. And we know when they've looked at stage 2, they're looking at north of 220 million. So Tauranga City councillors were told in 2020 that project was going to cost 85 million. It's now north of $1/3 billion. So project budgeting, not Tauranga City Council's strong point. Operational management. In the Local Government Act, there's a sort of a requirement, I'll put that in quotes, for councils to have balanced budgets. But unfortunately, in the sort of subsequent paragraphs, it basically says, but you don't have to if you don't want to. This financial year, the one that ends June 30th, so in a week's time or so, Tauranga City Council put together a budget which basically said, and these numbers are taken from the Strategy, Finance and Risk Committee report of around May 13, all public information. They have a budget which says we'll have a deficit of 50 million. And that's the budget, deficit of 50 million. Unfortunately, that Strategy, Finance and Risk Committee report forecasts that at the end of this financial year, there will actually be a deficit of 80 million. $30 million worse than a $50 million deficit. And there's a pattern of deficit budgeting in this council. So maybe that's another reason why our debt invariably is worse than we think it's going to be. Another possibility, and this is where things get interesting when we start to draw a link between what the numbers show and what Garth has been through, who this city's run for. There are three types of CapEx. CapEx is money you spend buying buildings and pipes and roads and all sorts of stuff. Yeah, it's not staff salaries which go, it's not depreciation which goes, it's not finance costs, that's part of your operational costs. CapEx is you're buying stuff. And there are three types of CapEx. One is replacement CapEx, typically funded out of depreciation. And ideally, councils should fully fund depreciation so that when it comes time to replace something, the money's sort of there. Another type of CapEx is called level of service CapEx. And this is when the community wants something better than they had before and the level of service, in inverted commas, is increased. And the third type of CapEx is growth CapEx. And as the label sort of suggests, it's the capex that you have when you're growing. You need new roads because you've got more people coming. You need new pipes because you've got more people coming. Growth capex. When I first got elected to council in 2013, Mayor Stuart Crosby told us that Tauranga City Council had a policy that growth pays for growth, which I think is a really good policy. Right? Why should the current residents pay for the infrastructure required for the growth? Pay for their own, definitely. In these 6 years, so 6 years of annual reports, 2018 through to 2023, 6 separate annual reports. If you add up the growth capex over those 6 years, right, the total comes to nearly $500 million. Now you may have heard, somewhere occasionally, once or twice, of the idea of development contributions. And development contributions are what cities ask for from developers to help pay the cost of infrastructure that's required by growth. Developers love growth. If you look at the Urban Task Force, you go to their website, the very first word in a series of big words, the very first word is growth. The development contributions over the same period, 200 million. So the growth capex, $500 million, 500 million. The development contributions total 200 million. Now I make that a shortfall of 300 million. Now you do get some contributions from other places. Wakakatahi, NZTA, they make a contribution on new roads. But the bottom line is, and don't just take my word for it, Simpson Grierson recently released a report. The bottom line is that New Zealand councils are not very good at using development contribution legislation to get a proper contribution to growth from developers. Simpson Grierson believes that councils should supercharge their efforts in this regard, because every bit that doesn't come from a developer winds up, that shortfall comes from you. So Simpson Grierson says, report released this year, that we should go harder on development contributions. So, let's have a look at what the plans are of the Commission in the area of development contributions. Remember, the last 6 years, 40% of growth capex. The red line is the growth capex in the long-term plan over the next 10 years. The green line represents the budgeted contribution of development contributions. And I know some of you have already cast your mind over those peaks and figured out that that's over $1.8 billion in growth capex over the next 10 years. And when you look at the green line, you probably figured out that that's less than 400 million in development contributions over the next 10 years. So rather than heeding the words of Simpson Grierson, not my words, I agree with them, Simpson Grierson, rather than heeding their words, we've gone from 40% collection over 6 years to just over 20% collection over the next 10 years. Now that difference, that $1.4 billion difference, well, just recently the developers paid for it. In the Bay of Plenty Times, Paul Adams, very comfortable with the fact, helped pay for a cocktail party, a leaving party for the commissioners. And why would he do that? Well, I think I can see 1.4 billion good reasons why he might want to do that. And those 1.4 billion good reasons probably more than cover the cost of the cocktails. It's enough about that. But we've got a picture here. This line represents the rates requirement over the next 10 years of the long-term plan. What you can see, it starts this year, we're at 290 million. The rates requirement in 2034, 770 million. 770 million. This year, 290, then 770. There was recently a candidate at, there's been these meetings, these candidate meetings. This is not a candidate meeting, right? This is a meeting to give you information. There was recently a candidate meeting for the Arataki ward. It's one of those, it's in the ballot meetings. It's in the ballot as a small group of relatively young people who think that democracy is not being served well and there's not enough public meetings and we need to expose candidates, and they're making an effort. And recently, in the Arataki meeting, the meeting that sort of gave you insight into the Arataki candidates, one particular candidate claimed that the rates increase wasn't 164%, it was 64%. So I just want to run you through the math, make sure we get this right. If you take 770 and you divide it by 290, you get 2.64 or thereabouts. You take 1 of 2.64 and that gives you 1.64. And as a percentage, that's 164%. If you come across a candidate who can't do basic arithmetic calculations, do not vote for them. The rates requirement will increase, according to the long-term plan, 164%. How reliable are Tauranga City Council's forecasts of a rates requirement? That they weren't too good on the debt number. Well, they're better. The good news is they're better. But the least variance I could find over a 9-year period was 25%. i.e. that what they said would be the rates requirement in 10 years' time, in 9 years' time was actually 25% higher. And we need to bear that in mind. So let's come back to the rates requirement. Because there are some things you need to think about to go from a rates requirement, which is the total rates collected from, to what the impact might be on you as an individual ratepayer. So I just want to break that down for you. One of the things you need to do is you need to take off growth, because in 10 years' time there will be more ratepayers. And these numbers are contained in the long-term plan, the 10-year plan. And it's not hard to do some basic maths and say, well, if we took out growth, what would the increase be then? The increase would be 140%, not 164. And you would have heard a mayoral candidate last night jumping on this and saying, well, see, look, it's not 164. You've got to take off growth. And it's true, you do. So we're down to 140. Also, one of the things the commissioners have done is they've sort of reweighted where they get the rates from. And I think this is a good thing. I've advocated for it. I think the way they've done it is brutal to certain industrial ratepayers. You couldn't have done that with democracy. You couldn't have been that brutal. But what that means is when you take into account that reweighting, the rates increase, if you like, for an individual ratepayer drops effectively to around about the 130% mark. So isn't that good news? Rates only going up 130%. And some people think, this is where we should stop. But of course, we've got the IFF, because the rates requirement doesn't include the IFF. So you've got to add that back in. Remember that 300 plus million, that 320 odd million, that's off the books. You're still paying that. So now we're back up to 130 odd. And then what you've got to factor in, over a 10-year period, is that they always understate what the rates requirement will be. And when you put that correction factor back in, you find we're back in slightly north of our original 164. Now you can pick any of these numbers depending on your prejudice and your biases and whether you're sponsored by the Urban Task Force. But I'll give them all to you. That's all of them. Right? Nothing on my sleeves but my arms. What does that mean? Even rates requirement, what does that mean for someone? What do those increases mean? So what I have a person in mind here. But you've got to think about, we have a lot of people in the city on fixed incomes, a lot of people in the city on pretty low incomes. Taronga's average household income is lower than the average household incomes of other cities, like Auckland or Wellington. Right? It's lower. So what you see here is, for someone on single super, their income this year is around about $27,000. And their rates, this person I'm thinking of, they live in a house which is below average capital value. Their rates this year are $3,350. So this year, their rates will account for about 12% of their total income. 12%. It's tough. We know it's tough. There's a cost of living crisis. 12% going up rates. And that doesn't pay their original council rates or their insurance or all the other things they need to actually just stay in the house. Let alone heat, light, food. 12%. If the rates requirement goes up to 164 and we don't make an adjustment for anything else, the share of their income required to pay rates in 10 years' time will be 27% of their income. Right? Their income goes up, by the way. Their income's adjusted by CPI. So their income goes up 23% over 10 years. Their rates requirement of the city goes up 164%. 23% on the income side, 164% on the rates requirement. But what about we adjust for growth? Well, then it's really good news, isn't it? Because we adjust for growth. I mean, there was a particular candidate, like it was Mahi Drysdale, was celebrating. Well, when you've got to factor in growth. Well, the good news is that means that that single pensioner only has to pay 23% of their income. Celebrate. Joy. Happiness. You take the differential, that single pensioner only has to pay 21% of their income. Over 20% of their income. But we know that we've got to factor in the IFF. We're now back up to 22%, I think, from memory. 22% of their income. And if we factor in the historical error, the historical underestimate of the rates requirement, guess what? We're back at 27% of their income. That principle applies to everyone here. Right? There are people on fixed incomes. There are people whose businesses are going back. Their incomes may be going backwards at the moment. Now, there's not many of us whose incomes are increasing at 100+%. I have a problem with this. I have a serious problem with this. I have a serious problem with the fact that growth in the city doesn't pay for growth. I think that to anyone with a heart, this long-term plan is unconscionable. I think to anyone who has a brain, this long-term plan is unsustainable. I think we need a new plan. The good news is there is a process by which you can do this. The commissioners used it. When they first came in, they signed off very quickly a 21-31 long-term plan. They've been there enough to be involved in signing off 2 long-term plans. But they did do it in a rush, and they realised that it wasn't exactly what they wanted it to be. So the following year, they used exactly this process, a long-term plan amendment process. So clearly it's doable, because the commissioners did it. And the new council could do it with the current plan. I think the new plan, I'll channel my Abraham Lincoln here, should be of the community, by the community, for the community, not of the commission, by the commission, for the developers. The good news is, unlike Abraham Lincoln, I love democracy. You know, the great thing about democracy is not that you get great leaders. And look, some of the past councillors, I've been scathing about the quality of councillors in there. Because when you look at some of the things that have happened in the past, to me they're indefensible, or at least the product of groups of people who are largely innumerate. But the great thing about democracy is not that it guarantees you good leaders, but it's when you get bad leaders, you can get rid of them without guns. I don't like guns. Scare the hell out of me. The great thing is you can have an election. And that's what we've got now. What Garth and I have tried to do here is to show you, give you another picture of what's happening in the city, where the money's going, and why you're currently looking at a city which is facing a debt burden in 10 years' time of $3 billion. Why you're looking at rates rises, no matter how you calculate, of well over 100%. Let's go back to that person's $3,350 rates, and let's put a number out there. We're talking over $8,800. From $3,350 to over $8,800 in 10 years' time. I just ask you to think about these numbers. I'm happy to work through them with anyone, happy to debate the numbers with anyone, debate the numbers, debate the facts, debate the evidence. Unfortunately, this election, it's very hard to find someone prepared to debate the numbers. Thank you very much.